Monotype. Welcome to Creative Characters from Monotype, a show where we meet the people designing the future of creative work and shaping our culture. I'm Bill, and this is Carl, and we are your hosts. Hello, Carl.
Hey, Bill. I am so excited for this week's episode.
You know, I am too. I have to tell the listeners up front that the recording of this episode was like 3 hours long.
Yeah, 2.5 and change.
The 2.5 with a half an hour of banter.
There was a lot of conversation once we were quote unquote done. But yeah, I felt real bad handing this one off to our producing team. Thank you, Chris and Marie.
Maybe someday we'll release the full unedited version of the conversation in our season recap.
That would have a very narrow audience, like a B-side.
My B-side, exactly. Why don't you tell everybody about the guests and about what y'all talked about?
Sure. We have two guests this week. They are Jes Seamans and Dan Black, who together make up Landland, a small art and printmaking studio based out of the upper Midwest. Their primary product is band and tour posters, and they have a range of clients from smaller indie groups like American Football to global acts like Childish Gambino and the Foo Fighters. And once you've seen a Landland print, you know a Landland print every time you see one. You know, the lettering is often derived from roadside signage, neon signs, what Dan calls the junk fortresses of the middle of nowhere America. So their style and technique and the overall look and feel of their work is instantly recognizable as theirs. And I think that they're just doing some of the most exciting work that's out there.
Yeah, what was interesting to listen to as a fly on the wall was that the fundamentals of the art has not changed, but the application as the world has become more digital and how that part of it has shifted over time. And to hear Jes and Dan talk about that was, I think, really fascinating.
Yeah, there's really two sort of stories that emerge from this episode. And one is exactly what you're talking about, which is, you know, how integrated typography and design is to the music industry. We talk about how back in the day when the three of us were, you know, in high school and college, bands and artists relied on posters to promote their shows. You know, you'd go to a venue, you'd see a band on your way out, you'd see a poster for a show 3 months down the line. And that was how you found out. You know, a lot of times these posters were very DIY, whether bands were using, you know, Letraset in the 70s and 80s or computers more recently, but type has always been a major component for bands and artists. As a company that does this stuff, you know, how have they evolved into the digital age where bands have access to Instagram, Bandcamp, all these different online channels where they can promote their stuff for free? So it's a really interesting dynamic that they've had to wrestle with. The other story is just going back to the theme we've talked about with previous guests like Lauren Halm and Jenna Blazevich about building a creative life. And I think in Dan and Jes, you basically have two kids who were into music, they were in bands, they were deep in their local, you know, underground music scene. They took the DIY ethos of that scene and just sort of organically turned it into a business.
Yeah, it's going to be a good one. I think the listeners will have fun learning about a new application of type and design. With that, I think we could turn it back over to you, Carl, and to Jes and Dan for a wonderful episode. Please enjoy, everybody.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carl. I'm the Senior Content Manager here at Monotype, and I am very excited to be talking with Dan Black and Jes Seamans of Landland. Dan and Jes, how are you guys doing this week?
We're good.
Hi.
Hello. Hey. I should say this is the first time we've ever had two guests on at once, so I was wondering if you could talk about where we find you today. And I'm also curious, you guys are both in the Midwest, so I'll give some of that away. But where are you from originally? Are you both natives to that area, or did you grow up someplace else?
I'm from Minnesota originally, outside of the Twin Cities and then rural Minnesota. And I lived in Minneapolis in high school and after high school for maybe like 10 years. That's where Dan and I met, but I am in Milwaukee now.
I moved to Minneapolis for college, but I was born in Texas and lived there as a little kid. And then my mom moved us out to like kind of the middle of nowhere in the desert in southern Utah. And I lived there until I was like in fourth grade or so. But
Oh, wow.
I've been in Minnesota since. Well, I moved to Chicago a few years back, and I was there for 6 years. And now I'm back in Minneapolis, and it's great.
Do you ever think about returning to Utah?
Oh, I think about it all the time. I have a feeling that it'd be really, really easy to buy a good chunk of land and like get storage containers and half bury them in the earth and make a giant studio out of that. But I also think I'm tethered to cities in a way that is like, I don't know. I
Insurmountable.
need what I need, I guess. Yeah.
Your work, it feels a bit urban or ex-urban maybe. And I wonder if leaving that would kind of be disruptive to your creative work, or do you feel like you could actually make that adaptation?
Yeah, a lot of what I look at when I'm out in the desert is the gas stations that are just dry rotting and these like weird, not quite ghost towns, but like remnants of things where people just packed up and just left, like what they had. There are a lot of people out there that kind of live in these like junk fortresses, all the cars on the farm and all, everything left how it is. I think I could thrive in a setting like that and just walk around bewildered all the time at how beautiful all of that is. But I mean, when I moved to Chicago, it was a similar thing where I was just like, there's steel bridges everywhere and there's warehouses that sort of look like they shouldn't be standing anymore and water towers on top of everything. I mean,
I think you're the kind of person that would find things to appreciate, aesthetically wherever you are. Fortunately, you're attracted to decay.
Right.
Which there's always some amount of that, whether you're in the middle of nowhere in a city.
Yeah. Well, in the desert, it just, it just sits there and cooks and everything stays, it ages and stuff, but I think it doesn't like fall down the way that it does here, where everything's like waterlogged and covered in snow and ice and stuff. Like it sort of just ages out there in a way that's like really beautiful, like all the signage and old hand painted billboards and everything. It's so expansive out there that there's almost no reason to take that stuff down. You know what I mean? Like you'll be out in the canyons and you'll see where like cars and trucks and stuff fell off the edge of things, and like I don't know, you can either spend a bunch of money doing a recovery mission and pulling that thing out of the canyon, or go home. You know what I mean? Like it's
just add it to the pile.
Yeah. No, totally. I mean, it's a lot of those gas stations and stuff, like, these towns that sort of tried to get started and didn't, and ended up just being like, some oil barrels like out off of some interchange or whatever. Like there's no reason to take it down until, it becomes busted into a million times and covered in graffiti and stuff.
Jess, what about you? So growing up in Minnesota, how has that experience sort of found its way into your work?
I feel like I was mostly living inside my head, but I wasn't, Dan has all these stories of like spending the day playing in the dump or like running wild, in the mountains. And I mean, it's not that I never went outside, but I don't think I have as strong of a connection to the landscape around me. I mean, I was in the suburbs for the first 10 years of my life. I've always been really attracted to green stuff and dense plant life that is Midwestern type of scenery, but I don't feel like that comes from my childhood necessarily.
Yeah. I feel like suburbs can do that though. Like I grew up in suburban New Jersey. It's just like you never know what town you're in because every town just bleeds into the next one.
I was in like a first ring suburb of Minneapolis, so it had like slightly more character than those ones that are more sprawl. The houses were closer together and smaller and stuff, and it was a little more diverse. But then we went from there to rural Minnesota, like halfway through elementary school, maybe, really rural Minnesota, Confederate flags everywhere, really different. And I was comfortable in a more urban environment as a kid. And to go from that to rural Minnesota, where there was lakes and woods and all kinds of ways to enjoy the natural environment. But I think I just associated where I was with these really like close-minded people that I was surrounded by and I didn't identify with at all, that I really just went into myself. So I like read books and drew pictures. But so it wasn't so much the homogeneity of the suburbs as just feeling like not seeing myself in any of the other people around me.
For a lot of people, you have this experience of a movie or a band or a particular song just sort of jumping out at you from kind of the general surface noise. And like, I'm just wondering if you as successful professional artists can look back on either a moment or a series of moments that really started to set you on a path.
My dad had a massive record collection, and I would just spend like hours. It was all on the floor. We didn't have any like shelving in our house for some reason for a long time. So all the records were on the floor. So I would just like sit on the floor and like look at the album covers.
Yeah.
And a lot of them were those kind of like 70s, like prog.
Oh my,
you know,
my
those,
dad
like,
had
painted,
those too. Emerson, Lake and Palmer.
Just like,
oh
yeah.
my God, he had some weird stuff.
Yeah. And those were kind of my first, like, you know, there's not a lot of appreciation in my family. We had like kids books and stuff, but nothing. All my exposure to, you know, illustration or like any kind of visual art really was either children's books or these like record covers.
Yeah. My dad wasn't a huge music person, but he was into like 70s prog, like Jethro Tull, and it was weird stuff.
I love
really
it.
Weird.
I'm really happy I have that in my background.
Yeah.
I feel like it gave me a broad appreciation for a lot of weird types of music.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is exactly that, but my musical upbringing was sort of the opposite of Jess's. Like when I lived in Utah, we were in complete seclusion. We didn't have access to like TV or records or any of that kind of stuff. So when I moved to Minnesota, when I was like in 4th, 5th grade or so, like I had a cousin who was a bit older and he was in bands and stuff. So I went straight from zero music to constant invitations as a small child to be like, this guy I know rented closed down department store and punk bands are going to play. You'll be the youngest kid there by far, but like go to this, it'll be cool. And I would go and just watch. It was incredibly addictive. You know, like it was really cool to see a community of essentially children in a small town make a thing that was fun and very, very cool. My impression from it was in order for a thing like that to exist, everyone needs to participate and everyone needs to like find their role in fostering that and making sure that it thrives. Otherwise it doesn't. So I was like in bands or whatever, and that wasn't really my lane. So it kind of ended up being posters and working for bands and just being present and going to those things and being psyched when people you know are doing cool things. I didn't realize that wasn't a thing that was happening everywhere, but I think I was lucky to have that kind of exposure to things at a really young age, you know?
Yeah, that's a perfect little bubble of DIY like spirit, isn't it?
Yeah. Looking back, I mean, it was wonderful. And it completely did a number on me because now I'm like, anything I can imagine happening, there's a route for it. If you want an event to happen, there are places to rent. If you want a record to happen, there are people you talk to and it happens. In the tiny world that we existed in, it was like everything seemed possible, you know? And I think I held on to that. We've sort of shaped this thing is like it has all these arms of production and design and just trying to make cool stuff happen so that there's cool stuff in the world and whatever we want to see, which is awesome and very fun. It's like very fun to have this job.
And Jess, what about you? I mean, can you point to a similar sort of singular thing, or is it more of a gradual process of finding that path for yourself?
I wasn't culturally deprived in exactly the same way as Dan, but I also like my dad had really intense, really specific tastes, and he was kind of like a taste tyrant, and like not like if he had super strong feelings about everything, like either things were great or things were terrible. So there was a lot of stuff that was not allowed in our house, basically. I was born in 1983. So I remember like a decent chunk of the 80s, and I have no connection to any 80s pop culture. Like nothing that people associate with the 80s pop culture wise was like allowed into my consciousness. So getting back to your original question, I do have this really clear memory of in my dad's mom's house, there was like a picture on the wall of a cat and some flowers. And I could tell that it was like created in some way that wasn't like a straightforward painting or wasn't a drawing. Like there were these like shapes, these flat shapes of color that were like overlapping, and there would be like a new color. Like you could tell like they were like laid down on top of each other and they were transparent and a new color was coming through. I have the really clear memory of like just staring at this picture at my grandma's house and and it never occurred to me to ask anybody like, what is this? Like, how is this made? I just like tried to figure it out on my own. And then I would go home and try to create it by making, stencils out of paper and trying to like lay down color of various
This is
mediums in
wild.
a way. Yeah, like I tried. So to get to the point, it was a screen print, and I was trying to like invent screen printing based on looking at this. And I feel like it's the same thing with music. Like I started a band when I was 12 with my best friend in my hometown. There was nobody else playing music there, and I didn't know how to play an instrument. It just felt like we were like inventing like like I didn't see the band that I wanted to be in anywhere, you know, and I didn't hear the kind of music that we wanted to make, so we just like invented it felt like we were just inventing a new thing. But being in that band is how these two things coming together is how I started doing posters. It was basically just that I was in a band that played a lot of shows and toured, and I can also draw, and I loved drawing. I mean, it was a way that I could combine the two things that I was doing, and I saw it as a way that I could contribute to the but I couldn't drive a car then, so I couldn't drive on any of our tours.
So you made the posters instead.
I can't drive a car, so I can at least design our flyers.
Yeah, I can make merch and do our posters. And believe it or not, you know, in the early 2000s, you actually had to advertise your shows with physical posters.
Yeah.
And if you
Yeah.
had, and I really believe that, you know, the cooler the poster, the more likely people were to come to the show. So I tried to make cool, interesting posters and actually go around and hang them up.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about Landland. First of all, let's talk, how did you guys meet?
We met like 100 times. It was really weird.
Oh yeah, we later found out that we had met. So I was actually living in Seattle right after high school. I moved out to Seattle briefly for no good reason. And I went to a Sweep Lake Johnny show and I bought a poster. They had these really cool screen printed posters that were on chipboard. When I got it home, I saw on the back it had a stamp that said something like hand printed at the 2222 screen print facility in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Is that what it said, Dan?
That was what it said.
And there was an email address. And
Real official.
It seemed really official to me. It sounded
The
like
email I got from you asking if you could work for me was really official sound. It was like, I'm moving. Hi, I bought this poster and I'm moving. This is what you sound like. And I'm moving back to Minneapolis and like I'm gonna need a job. So if you've got a job, and I had to write this like really humbling response, just being like, look, it's a lie. Like this was the first poster I ever made that left the city of Minneapolis. I'm a dude printing in, you know, I can't remember if I was still in school, if that was like my year off. Like I dropped out of college and then took a year off to work at Kinko's, which was funny. And then it wasn't, so I went back. But I think this was in the year off. Like I was still like breaking into the print shop and screen printing stuff. But it was like, yeah, you know, when I'm not like breaking into my old school, I just screen print in my living room. I can't hire you.
I like that our first interaction was me calling your bluff.
Oh, yeah, that set the tone. That's good.
So then I was like, "Oh, sorry. Okay, thank you. Never mind." But then I was moving back to Minneapolis, but we had no intention of meeting each other. We just had this email exchange. That was it. And then like a few weeks after I got back to Minneapolis, I ran into a friend from my high school who was like, "Hey, I'm starting a band. Do you want to play bass?" And I said, "Okay. Sounds good." So I went to this first practice and Dan was the singer in the band. And somehow we discovered that, you know, he was the person that I had sent this email to.
But then the craziest thing was, so when I was in bands in like early college and stuff, a friend of ours from home was sort of like the unofficial like fifth member, and he was just like photographing everything, you know, and taking videos of stuff or whatever. And one day we were looking through his photos of shows years and years before, and
like 1998 or something.
Yeah, something like that. And there were all these photos of like the bands we played with, and there's like Tiny Jess playing bass in one of them. And I was like, what the fuck? It was like such a weird, disorienting shock. And then we found out that our bands played a show in St. Cloud, Minnesota, like years before.
A city that neither of us lived in. Anyway, so we found out that we had met, or we had played a show together like 10 years earlier.
once I was out of school, we were sort of like moving whatever like ramshackle screen printing equipment that we had. We were moving it into like any space that would have us, pretty much. It was like other people's basements.
For years.
We spent a Minnesota winter printing in a shed behind someone's house.
Yeah.
And like washing screens outside with a hose, and like it'd be this crazy race where you would like, wash the thing out, and then you had to get the screen back inside to dry before the water on the screen froze.
Because it would like break it.
Screen. Yeah. I mean, it was hell. It was crazy.
It was awful.
And there were three of us. It was me and Jess, and then our friend Matt Zahn, who I had worked with at Kinko's, and then later we got jobs as like designers at Target. So we were all kind of making posters and stuff. But at some point, the borrowing people's basements and rebuilding our setup every time we wanted to print, like all that stuff got to be way too much work for what we were doing. So we found a studio in Northeast Minneapolis that was like a small room, but it was really cheap, and moved there. And that's when we were kind of like, the thing needs a name. And at that point in time, me and Matt, we wanted to pull Jess in as an illustrator whenever she was able and whenever she wanted to. And I drew a lot as a kid and before college. And in college, I think art school does a really weird thing to you where you feel, up until that point, you feel like you're really special and gifted in a way because everyone tells you that you're good at drawing. And then you go to art school and it's like, oh, they've plucked every single one of those kids from every town all around and everywhere else and throw them in a big pool. And like, objectively, I was not good at drawing. It was not really a thing that came naturally to me in any way. I essentially became like a graphic designer in college, and I switched my major from printmaking to that. And like all my design work was not hand illustrated at all until after college. And I sort of was like, I'm going to make myself learn how to draw, and I'm only going to draw my work from here out until I feel like I'm good at it.
I think that's a tough experience. It's one thing to be the best at something in your town, but then there's this moment when you leave your town, you're like, oh, there's one of me in every town, and sometimes 2 or 3 or 10 in every town.
Yep.
And I think that's, and I wonder if that's where a lot of people drop off, that they realize, so like, I was special here, but I'm not so much out in the world. And how do you push through that feeling? Is it a matter of trying harder? Is it finding your niche and like your strength and just honing it? Or it sounds like you were just almost like stubborn about it.
Sort of. I mean, there was like a convergence of that. Stubbornness is probably one of my more defining characteristics, but it was like that. And then at the same time, I was interested in posters and stuff. At that point in time, making posters was not a job. You could not make a real living doing it. It didn't exist the way that it does now. And what they looked like was wildly different, like Jay Ryan's work. And it was like this complete epiphany of, oh, these can actually be whatever you want. You know what I mean? Like as long as you do the thing well, in his case, you can have an army of squirrels attacking an astronaut and it can say shellac on it, and all of that makes a cohesive thing if you've done it well. A lot of our early posters were really just like wild exploration of what a poster could be, and like, does it need to be terribly legible? How does the information work? Can it just be a pattern that looks nice?
For years, the posters that we were making were either for our own bands or for
the bar was low.
Friends bands. The bar was low, but it was also, we had such freedom, I would make posters for people and they wouldn't even know what it looked like until, I was hanging them up for them or whatever. Like, we just had so much freedom. There was almost no art direction. Yeah. And when anyone tried to art direct us,
good luck.
I had a really hard time with that.
How did you start to narrow or define the aesthetic that you were going to work in? Because I feel like you see a poster and you're like, that's a Landland poster.
I don't know if it was a conscious thing aside from like just pushing against the things that we didn't want to make, There was a lot of,
that's true.
There was a lot of that. I think we both came to this with a certain kind of attitude being like, well, we're not going to do this. You know what I mean? And nowadays you would call it disrupting the, we were trying to be like disruptors, but we were trying to just make stuff that was exciting to us, but kind of like mundane by, subject matter standards. And then I sort of fell into this hole of how can I best render this aging wood grain? And, and then here I am.
Yeah, I feel like I was definitely motivated by, I mean, as one of the few women who were ever doing this type of thing.
Especially then.
Yeah, especially then. And then especially then when I just feel like 85% of gig posters were like ladies in bikinis on like a rocket ship or whatever. And I was always so grossed out by that. I feel like I was really motivated by a hatred for that kind of work and wanting to be like, band posters can be, you know, they don't have to have like hot ladies on them all the time. Yeah.
I did some reading, some interviews you guys have given in the past. And at the time you said you were surprised how often people guess the creator of a specific piece wrong. So they would say like, that's a Jes piece, that's a Dan piece, and they would be incorrect, is what you said at the time. And so I'm sort of wondering if you guys could talk a bit about how your perspectives complement each other and what that collaboration process is like, especially since you don't currently live or work in the same city, and how do you sort of stay tethered to each other while allowing space for each of you to pursue your own vision.
I've definitely always felt like we've benefited from having really different skill sets. Would you say we do, right, Dan?
Oh,
you would
yeah.
say that?
No, totally.
I was thinking about this recently, like how our working relationship has shifted over time. I also think that because we've always been such close friends who really care about each other, I feel like a lot of the ways that we work and the way it's changed over time has been a result of us trying to help each other and make sure that the other one is like getting what they need or making the other one's job easier in what way we can, you know?
Yeah, that's.
Do you know what I mean, Dan?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, no, I think that's like the constant, and it's funny because like when we talk about the quote unquote business model, you know, really anyone else that does this, it sounds like we're like lunatics or like that we're like,
which we might be,
real like culty. I think because Jes and I are on the same wavelength in so many ways, we have had like an evolving relationship to how we're making the work and how we are interacting with and helping each other do the thing. I think the interview that you're talking about, we were pushing really hard to have it be where our work was very intertwined. And it might have been me more than Jes, but like really strict about everything's credited as Landland and it should be ambiguous. I think that was also because maybe at the time we hadn't really realized what our strengths were, and it made sense to just, you know, approach a project by throwing everything in a pot and trying to like both of us just hack away at whatever we thought was like the best solution for it. And now because things are more chill, I mean, you know, back then we were making honestly like 50 or 60 posters a year, you know, I mean, it was breakneck speed, and now things are way more relaxed and way more chilled out. And I think, you know, now when we approach a project, there's like a real delegation where it's like, well, this sounds more like a Jes thing, like, you know, Jes handles the illustration or whatever. And then like, you know, it comes time to print it. That's, you know, like my thing or whatever. And our roles feel better, you know, and also with like Jes being, you know, she's part of the vacuum, which was sort of like a collective of illustrators. And that's very much more like focused on the individual, or it just makes sense for us to kind of be calling out the individual work that we're both doing.
I think also a factor is that like when I met Dan, you know, I was only 18. So he's 5 years older than me. But at the time, he seemed like such an adult, you know? It's my little 18-year-old self. But also because Dan taught me how to do so much. And when this started to actually turn into a full-time job, which wasn't, you know, until maybe like 6 or 7 years into it, I think it was harder for me to figure out who I was like as an artist or illustrator, like separate from you. I mean, I feel like I didn't deal with type for a long time. I knew that you were like good at it and understood it in a way that, you know, I never would. And you went to school for these things. So I saw that as giving you this, you know, this credibility that I didn't have.
That was like an early division of labor, was like Jes would make the thing and I would figure out how to cram type into it. And I'd just be like, I'll totally do that. Just leave me a space. Just leave me some kind of area.
Or I would do my type with like a Sharpie, and you would give me a hard time.
That's nice. We'll fix that.
Yeah, totally. You don't mind if I go in here a little bit, right?
Right, exactly. I mean, even down to that, you had to teach me how to use Photoshop. I mean, really, like every.
But now you're better at it than I am.
I know, but that was, you know, that's a new development.
Yeah.
I was going to say, it sounds like the studio kind of gave you a structure in which both of you could find your lane, grow a bit, right? While also building a business.
Internally, we know that the only defining thing of what Landland is we just want it to be whatever's best for both of us. Like, frankly, the kind of work and all that stuff we're making is secondary to, are we doing what we want to be doing? And I like that there are parts of our work and our job that they need to be deciphered in a way. I just think it's more interesting to be in a position where you're not just like handing everything to people. Like, I think it's fun to make work that's complicated, even if it's like a division of labor complication or whatever that is sort of like thrown into the world. And I feel like that kind of thing is like way more rewarding to people when the puzzle's put together.
It's probably gotten in the way, a few times of
us being more successful.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Oh, for sure.
I've been a huge fan of your work since I saw it the first time. And I think this is what I've noticed is that whatever you're illustrating or drawing, you're always looking up at something. And so even like a 2-story building has an almost like castle-like quality to it. That to me starts a story about whatever the subject matter is, because often the subject matter is some like derelict gas station or or kind of like fantastical scene of like birds or trees or something like that. When I look at like the full breadth of your work is a kind of like almost like loving perspective of sometimes ugly things.
Yeah, a lot of Dan's work is drawn from photographs that he takes on his road trips.
It's funny, when I'm at these locations, usually it's just me and, my car or whatever, but there are things out there in the world that hold my attention, and sort of like the quiet moments of these really mundane artifacts of lives having occupied space. And so that Fort Courage, like the hop along poster, it's kind of a mashup of a couple different locations, but it's both places where like I essentially had to like yank the wheel and pull off the road and just like sit and wander around these spots.
That's a way that we're really different.
Yeah.
I almost never work from photos.
Yeah. I'm looking at, I might pronounce it, but one of your prints, Bucali, right now. And I think what I see in your work is like a similar feel, but obviously very different subject matter. But like this is like an epic twisting spiral of dirt and earth, and but then like also like decaying furniture and mattresses and a million crows. And I look at that and it's a beautiful print and it's a beautiful illustration.
Because I think we both always felt outsidery, we like our whole lives have felt kind of like weirdos. I think that makes you like very observant person, because you kind of always feel like you're a little bit outside of stuff. Observing, I think most artists feel this way, I'm sure. But I feel like our work is very like observed looking, not photorealistic or something, but I feel like we both consider, every
I feel like there's a lot of care.
Yeah, care and thought and like observation. Part of it, honestly, is having to work within just a couple formats, a couple like proportions that we've been working in for 15 years. And a lot of it really is just like trying to make a somewhat dynamic composition that, brings you into like different places on it in the same like 18 by 24 or 16 by 24.
That 18 by 24 ratio is like really weird to, Also, I think when I'm at those places, it feels like the thing's been there forever, like it's just been like sitting there aging, but there's like a panic of like, if I don't look at this thing super thoroughly and if I don't like examine everything there is to examine, I don't have trust that the thing's going to be there the next time I come through. You know what I mean? And I've like crisscrossed the country, God, like hundreds of times at this point. And I have like a mental inventory of, here's where a water park is. Here's, this completely uneventful like Sinclair billboard that's made out of cut wood that like I stalked around and made into a knapsack poster years ago. And a lot of times, like that Fort Courage thing, like neither of those things exist anymore. Like the billboard itself or that cafe is gone, like wiped off the earth forever. So there's sort of like a panic of, since I'm here in this place right now, I want to like figure out a good way to immortalize the thing, because I mean, slowly we're losing all that stuff. The old Route 66, all those signs, like all those crazy signs, they're all disappearing and ending up in, fenced off yards and places that, you can't see them in the wild anymore. And it's like, it's such a bummer.
walk me through the poster you did for Childish Gambino at Coachella, because I feel like this poster captures so much about what you guys do, and I would love to know about how you approach the task of embedding all of the information about the performance into the image itself, and what was the source of inspiration for this piece.
Well, I had done a Childish Gambino poster the year before, or maybe it was earlier that year, and the direction was very heavy on like the This Is America, thing. And being in Chicago, the show was happening right around the same time as the Laquan McDonald, who was essentially a child that was really gratuitously killed by police there. That was sort of the climate of what was happening in town at the time. And, I made a poster that in my mind was subtly angry towards the police. Like,
it was a bunch of smashed up cop cars.
Yes, but by the time the Coachella stuff had rolled around, I think they were like moving away from This Is America, but I was still like very fixated on what America feels like. And I think with Coachella, the imagery around that festival and the attitude around all of it, I don't want any part of at all. So I sort of like honed in very much on the good parts of this convergence of people from all over the world, and the traveling that would be inherent in that, and driving through the desert and landmarks that you would pass by as you're going through like southern Nevada or whatever. Yeah. This building is actually, it's a service station in St. Paul that I used as reference. Yeah. But out there in the desert, you come across these strange folkloric shrines of things. You know what I mean? Like things that have been assembled. There are rocks, these like black rocks that are like assembled into messages. And like there are these trees that just have hundreds of pairs of shoes hanging off of them. So that, and then just like thinking about like westward movement in general, and the trajectory of us moving into like an era that is sort of ideally abandoning fossil fuels, and the collateral damage of that sort of transition is these gas pumps and things will essentially become payphones. And obviously there are so many ways that that's like a good thing, but I think this felt very much like a snapshot of America. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So Dan's really, really gotten good at printing CMYK in order for me to be able to do this watercolor stuff for the color for the posters. I mean, this is a nice thing about handling the printing ourselves.
So I did all the line work, the key plate drawing and stuff. And usually what I would do is, once I pin down roughly what that is like, I send it over to Jess, and she starts working on the color for it at the same time I'm working on the final drawing. So she's, and as long as she sticks to the sketch and I stick to the sketch, later we can merge them together. And, there's some cleanup afterwards and everything, but, for the most part, everything fits back together really well. And for me, it's really nice because sometimes I'm real specific about like, this thing needs to be blue or whatever. But like a lot of times it's just a nice way to like roll the dice on the outcome of a poster.
And I would say you don't love dealing with color. And is that not true?
No, I like it. I mean, I do. I just, when it comes back and like the texture that Jess gets out of it with like all the like the reticulation of the water, like where there's like the parts where it kind of dried irregularly and, all those edges and things, it adds a layer to the part that I'm doing that makes it just like wildly more interesting to me. And then it's also just, I like testing myself all the time with this. So, the crazier her watercolor stuff gets, the more I'm like, what do I need to learn how to do to pull off printing this so it doesn't just look like a mess? And
I don't think anyone else does their posters this way, right? Like, I don't think combining a painting with a key plate layer, like a line layer, I haven't seen it
with any regularity. I can't think of anything. I don't know.
But yeah, Dan's basically sending me the line art for a poster, and then I'm making a watercolor painting that lines up with it. And then
I break it out. Well, we combine it and then I break it out to be screen printable. Yeah.
So he's printing the watercolor part kind of separate, CMYK process printing, and then printing like a black or whatever color the key plate is on top of it. Yeah. So it's not, the line work isn't part of the CMYK print, if that makes sense.
We can get like real process nerdy for you if you want.
Right.
Well, I'm curious how you achieve the watercolor look through screen printing.
God, it's been so much experimenting. So in Photoshop, you can see a full color image. You can separate out the individual channels. So you've got like cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. You can isolate those channels and assign a halftone to it. And you assign like the angle that the dots are in, and then the frequency of the dots. And that sort of is like how large they are, for screen printing, traditionally you would want those to be like pretty coarse, because when you're printing, there are all these issues with like ink drying in the screen, or the dot just not being able to be held by the emulsion in the screen. There are all these problems. We had shied away from doing anything like this for a really long time. And then back in 2010, I think, we tried it. Jess was doing all this watercolor stuff, like all these paintings and all these things that weren't showing up in our work at all. And it was like, there's this entire other skill set that we haven't represented. And wouldn't it be cool if we could like figure out a way to make that? I mean, it was all really analog, but it was like shapes, like drawn shapes tiled up and, transparent inks and all that stuff. So we did it once, and it, to my eye at the time, it worked out perfectly. It was like a total fluke. So then we became very addicted to that process, and then spent like the next few years trying to get back to whatever worked that time.
Yeah. So you basically, you need Photoshop. There's a digital element to being able to make the screens for it.
But yeah, it's been fun. I mean, there's, when we're printing, there are all these variables, like the, how opaque and how transparent the inks are, and, the order that we print them in. And
I mean, I think we also benefit from both of us being printers as well, and having printed our own work. So like when we're working on the front end of it, we're like thinking about like, can this work? Can I like push this a little bit and still make it work printing? Which I think also like has had a big role in shaping what our stuff looks like.
Yeah, I mean, screen printing, it just beats problem solving into you. You know what I mean? Like it's a never ending parade of just like, I feel like I'm pretty good at this. Oh no, I straight back to the ground. Like there's always a thing that like makes you feel like you suck at it really bad.
Yeah.
And I think I've been doing this long enough that I think all the lower level problems are pretty diagnosable, and now we're just on to like the bigger scale ones.
This might be a real deep hole to get into, but I think what you just said there, that idea of like, is it still there? Mm-hmm. What I think of when I look at a lot of the work you guys do is this idea of hanging on to places, and places hanging on, and you're kind of rooting for them in a way. And I think, when you get into some of the lettering styles that you have that's inspired by like hand painted sign or hand painted billboards and stuff like that. And I feel like there's a real kind of love for those things, but then also that idea of like, is this place still there? Will it still be there when I go again? Talk about some of those points of inspiration and how you utilize them in your work to convey what needs to be conveyed, but preserve a style or a period of time, that's kind of slipping away maybe.
I think as far as like the typography and stuff, I have always like almost to a degree that is bordering on a weird, like embarrassing obsession. I've always been like really, really into signs and signage. Like my mom taught me to read when I was 2 off of like reading, like first it was like street signs and things like that. I think as a small child, I imprinted, or like those signs like imprinted on me in a really weird way, where I like wanted to have photos taken next to them. And I want, and my dad was a pipeline guy. The crew of people under him would like steal highway signage and sneak it back to me. So the walls would be covered in stolen signs, like stolen like highway signage. And I had like a mental running list of like what I was like, it'd be really cool to get one of those railroad crossing signs, because it's like a giant X. And, I gotta have this like, my dad ended up stealing one of those enormous highway rest area signs with the arrow that points to exit,
Really?
And yeah, he stole it and drove it to my grandma's house. It was like strapped to the bed of a pickup truck. I mean, they're enormous. Yeah. And he kind of like plopped it in her yard and was like, got this one. And all like me as a kid, I was just like, this will not fit through a door. You know what I mean? Like it's like, there's literally nothing we can do with this, you strange man. But I look at a lot of like the hand painted stuff, and on top of it being something that's going away, there's also, I think I have like a real affinity for the working class attention that is paid to signs like that. I just love what it looks like to, someone just like went out and like painted the thing, what I mean? And when it's well crafted, it's like amazing. And when it's not, it's also amazing. You know what I mean? I think I like being able to see where the brush strokes have aged and started to fall apart. Like, the thing looks nice and shiny and pristine when it's first painted, and then like give it 35 years in the sun and you start to see all of the mark making of the people that did the thing, or, I think when advertisers stop paying rent on those wooden billboards, it might be like a recycling thing too, but like they scramble them, you see the most wild messes essentially out there, and that stuff is definitely not long for the world.
Music and design have always been linked and always will. Even though music is now largely online, there's still album covers and art that goes with it. But posters were not just nice to have. They had a really integral role in promoting shows, especially DIY or small venue shows. When you'd go see a band play, and on the way out, you'd see a poster on the wall. It's like, oh, this other band is coming in like 3 weeks. I should go check that out. Not really the case anymore with bands having social media accounts and Bandcamp and all these other outlets for getting their music and their tour dates in front of the right people. So talk about like how your role in like the music industry has changed and what that connection has been like, and kind of where you see it maybe going.
I think what we used to do was a real promotion device. You make a fancy poster and it entices somebody to go to an event. And now we have sort of like an opposite thing happening now, where like the bands we're working for largely don't want us to show any glimpse of the thing that we're working on until people see it at the merch table. It's very commemorative. And I think, they had a struggle where when things dropped off and people stopped buying records in like a real big way, merch sales is a large part of the revenue and the reason that bands go on tour. So they needed something to replace that. And for a while they were trying like real cartoonish, like lampshades and, umbrellas and whatever. But I think posters have been like a mainstay. It's like a thing that people are used to. And, there's a sort of an expectation that bands of a certain size will have them at this point. But yeah, I think that's like mostly what we're making is like commemorative things, which to me is less exciting than seeing it around town. And like, I don't know. It'd be strange to see the stuff we're doing like stapled to telephone pole, like that doesn't really exist anymore. But like,
we also couldn't make a living when it was just promotional.
We definitely couldn't make a living. Yeah, I mean those budgets, like, I mean it was hard because it used to be working for venues, like when that was going on, and they didn't want to spend more than they had to on things like that to begin with. And then once the internet became where everyone found that stuff, they were just like, could be fun, you know what I mean? And then the model sort of changed into this thing of like, yeah, if you want to make a poster, you can show up at the show and sell them. And that created a really strange relationship where like the venue was giving the blessing, but then you would show up and like, meet the band or the merch person and be like, hey, could you clear off a space for these posters I made for your band? And they're just like,
oh, I forgot how we had to go sell them at the shows.
Who are you?
Yeah, they were just like, we didn't ask you to do anything. Like, why would we do this?
Why are you taking our merch table space?
Yeah,
totally
exactly. If someone has
that.
$20 to spend, like, why? It became like a real disservice to bands.
That's funny.
In that case. And thankfully now we're exclusively working with bands and their management companies and things like that. And like merch companies, like the bands kind of hand the keys over to a handful of companies that just fill our schedules with posters and stuff, which is great. It's like wonderful. But yeah, I don't know. And it sort of becomes a thing that is way more about what happens after the event, like people collecting things, or especially in the case of like, Fish and some of the larger bands, like, there's like a thing where when the poster is released, there's going to definitely be a reaction to it. And we've had it beaten out of us to like care too much, but you look at it, you know what I mean? If everyone hates the thing you've made, it doesn't feel great. But
well, there's a weird thing too, where because there's like one or two of these commemorative posters for the show, but every show is the show that the people attending it go to. So
they place varying amounts of emphasis on
people can get really resentful if their show has a poster that they don't like. There's a weird amount of pressure on it.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because some of these bands have, they have the kind of following that is almost, it's almost like a co-op where these people are like stockholders, you know what I mean? Like they've
right.
gone to hundreds of these shows.
That's
and
a good way to put it.
Bought thousands of dollars of merch or whatever. So they effectively feel like they've got a say, you know what I mean? Like they've got license to like weigh in a way that's like way more personal. Like it's like
directly emailing the artist.
Yes. Yeah. We got some of that early on where people would email us and be like, I don't really reach out to artists often, but like, I have to tell you that like you hurt our feelings by making a poster that we can't hang up to commemorate our summer trip, and it's just like,
yeah,
I don't know what to say. I mean, what do you say?
That's tough. Yeah.
And it's like anything, like the people that are fans of those bands are deeply entrenched in like subculture in a way that I have full appreciation for. A parallel I have to a lot of the jam bands that people are very excited about would be like, something like Fugazi, where there's, those shows, there was an attention to detail. There was like, there's a mystique around certain aspects of it. And I don't know, in my mind, it makes me work harder to deliver a good thing for people that are that excited about the thing, even if I don't relate to the thing. Like I have the hardest, actually, Jess knows this very well. I have like the hardest time making posters for bands that I love or that I'm like really attached to. There have been several times where like personal dream jobs, I have clammed up and been like, Jess, you really got to take this. Like, I want this to happen by our hand, but like, I can't, I'm too inside this. And it's kind of nice because then she, graciously puts up with my request and does the thing and it ends up looking great. And then, I feel, I don't know, like we've sort of like done a service to a band I care about, which is really nice. It's a good feeling.
And like last thing, speaking of music, is you put out music yourself.
I was very attracted to putting out records and like the whole process of like sourcing vinyl and dealing with the packaging and like all of that. But there were some like very large and necessary steps of running a record label that I could not do and had no interest in doing. And a lot of that had to deal with like PR stuff and distribution and, like the things that are like completely reasonable expectations of a record label. But at the time I was just like, I facilitate getting the thing made and then we shake hands and you take a stack of them and then we just go our own ways. And as time has gone on, I sort of dropped the resistance to record label duties, and now I'm very upfront. Like when I'm working with a band that I haven't worked with before, I'm just like, look, there are parts of this that we're very good at. Like we make really nice records that feel good in a person's hands. Yeah, they sound really good, and ideally, the people that gravitate towards the things that I'm making will understand what the through line is between the records we're making and the posters we're making and like all of the other million projects that we have going on. And if they are a fan of our work in general, they understand this extension of it. I joke that it's like an expensive hobby. Essentially, I have like a real like Robin Hoodie kind of approach to it where it's like if we make a like a Dave Matthews Band or whatever poster, some of that money ends up being filtered into making like a Joan of Arc record. You know what I mean?
I love that.
And it feels good. I mean, it feels really good.
Yeah, the label I think is a logical extension of everything else. It fits, and it's a good soundtrack to your aesthetic, I think. So people should go check it out. Jess and Dan, thank you for taking a good chunk of time out of your afternoon on this extremely humid August day.
Yeah, thank you for having us and for the invitation.
Thank you so much.
And for listening to us ramble.
Babble.
Thanks for listening. If you want to learn more about Landland, check out landland.bigcartel.com or follow them on Instagram at landlandcoalportage or find our blog post at monotype.com/podcast. If you're enjoying Creative Characters, please head over to your podcast provider of choice to rate and review this episode. Even better, subscribe to the show and share us with your friends. Creative Characters is a production of Monotype with Christopher Sound and Marie Tabarez. We'll be back soon with more episodes. Take care.